Welcome everyone to the Youth Career Mentorship Program. Tonight we have youth, parents, educators, and school administrators, hopefully that are still joining us from all around the US, from Canada, Dominican Republic, Barbados, Brazil, Portugal, Spain, and China. So I know some of you are missing sleep to be with us, and I thank you and welcome you. The Social Justice Initiative is launching this series with the hope that collectively we can learn how to direct our talents and passions to the service of our communities, what principles should guide our work in order for this purpose to be fulfilled, how our work can build unity across cultures and peoples, and how work done in a spirit of service to others can unlock human capacity and release our creative powers. During this pandemic, we have more time to engage in such reflections. We have access to a group of excellent scholars to whom we would not have otherwise. And we are experiencing firsthand how today's most pressing problems are global, and that the suffering of one is the suffering of all. The presenters in this series have not only achieved excellence in their field of work, but have also applied their knowledge and expertise to address different types of social injustices, and have advanced inclusion and equity at the local and global levels. Tonight, we have the honor of having with us Professor Michael Karlberg. Professor Karlberg teaches communication studies at Western Washington University. His work examines prevailing conceptions of human nature, power, social organization, and social change, and their implications for the pursuit of peace and justice. His research and activism focus on the need to move beyond the prevailing culture of conflict and competition in order to establish a more just and sustainable social order based on recognition of the organic oneness of humanity. His publications include Beyond the Culture of Contest, From Adversarialism to Mutualism in an Age of Interdependence, Reframing Discourses for Peace and Justice, Discourse, Identity, and Global Citizenship, among many others. As Professor Karlberg goes through his presentation, I encourage you to type your questions in the question and answer box on the bottom of your screen. We'll go through some of these questions in the second half of the session. So with that, I'll give the floor to Professor Karlberg. Professor Karlberg, welcome.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jalali, for inviting me and for organizing these important conversations during this difficult time. I thought I would maybe start by sharing a bit of my story, how I ended up doing what I currently do, and then I'll talk a little bit about my work that I'm involved in. I grew up not far from where Dr. Jalali is. I was in Illinois, central southern Illinois, not far from Missouri. And my mother descended from Appalachian coal miners and rural working poor. And it was a fairly racist, segregated part of the country when she grew up. She was raised in part by her grandmother, who took a stand against racism by opening her home to Black folks and their causes of that time. And she in turn raised me to care about these issues. I remember as a teenager, she asked me to read the diary of Malcolm X, one of the leading figures of the civil rights movement, and Buried My Heart at Wounded Knee, which is about the hardships and suffering that some of the Native Americans went through at the hands of settlers, and other literature like that. When I went on to college, I wanted to make a difference in the world, leave it a better place, and I found it. I decided to major in environmental studies as an undergraduate student. And I ended up teaching that subject for a while at the high school level. And during that time, I came to the conclusion that many of my students, their views about the natural world were profoundly shaped by television. This was before the internet and social media. So I became curious about how television and media impact us as a social force. And I decided to go to graduate school. I worked on a master's degree, later a PhD in media studies, where I increasingly began to focus on the ways American media exert a polarizing and divisive force on our society. They exert a force that makes it difficult for us actually to solve the social and environmental problems we face. I ended up writing a book titled Beyond the Culture of Contest, which you heard referred to. And my program of research ever since has expanded on this theme. So let me talk a little bit about this theme. In American society, where I largely grew up, I also spent part of my life in Canada and a few other places, but American society and Western civilization more generally structures almost every social institution as a contest of some kind, right? We structure governance as a partisan political contest. We structure, in many countries, the legal system as a contest of advocacy in front of a judge or jury. We structure the economy as a contest of capital accumulation, wealth, and consumption. We structure education as a contest for grades, recognition, awards, and opportunities. And we even organize many forms of recreation and leisure as physical or mental contests. And then, of course, our media system, especially commercial media in countries like the United States, amplifies and exaggerates all of these other contests and makes them seem like inevitable expressions of human nature. But they're not. The human sciences are increasingly demonstrating that humans are wired for both competition and cooperation. And which one of these is more fully expressed in our behavior is largely a result of how we're educated and trained. But why care about all this? Ultimately, I've come to care because all of these contests are contests of power. Political power, economic power, physical power, intellectual power, and in some cases military power. And who has the advantage in a contest of power? Well, it's pretty obvious. The groups that enter the contest with the most power have the advantage. So the culture of contest that we've constructed tends to privilege the most powerful social groups, groups that have inherited wealth, social status, and other things. And at the same time, it tends to subordinate the needs and interests of less powerful social groups, disadvantaged and marginalized social groups. So the culture of contest is structured to increase social injustice and inequality. And there's a lot of evidence for this, which I examined in my research. For instance, the most competitive culture on earth, American culture, also has the greatest disparities of wealth and poverty of any affluent society by far. We also have the most deeply entrenched forms of racism, along with some other oppressive tendencies that are an outgrowth of this culture of contest. But the culture of contest doesn't only result in social oppression, it also divides us from one another in ways that make it impossible to address the increasingly complex problems and issues we face on the planet today, from global warming to the current pandemic. And we could come up with a long list of other problems that we're not doing so well on. So if we want to overcome social problems like extreme economic inequality and racism, and if we want to solve complex problems like climate change and global pandemics, we have to move beyond the culture of contest. But this raises the question of how can we do this? So as I began to really examine that question, it led me to look closely at nonviolent social movements. What can we learn from them? And when I did this, I encountered a paradox. The culture of contest produces many forms of injustice and oppression, as I've been talking about. And in response, not surprisingly, many thoughtful people become concerned, begin to protest, engage in civil disobedience and other nonviolent strategies. Even though these nonviolent tactics are not violent, they are still oppositional. And they replicate the culture of contest in struggles to change the culture of contest. So that's a paradox, because they tend to reinforce its underlying logic and perpetuate the culture of contest along with the problems it gives rise to. So this is a really challenging sort of dilemma to figure out how to get out of. How do you change a system that's oppressive without perpetuating the system in other ways? So what I've begun to kind of recognize and argue in my work is that if we're serious about moving beyond the culture of contest, we need to use other methods. And fortunately, there are other methods we can use. Interestingly enough, Gandhi, who's often considered one of the sort of founding figures of nonviolent action, he actually wrote about these other methods. But it's part of his nonviolent philosophy that most people ignored or have forgotten. Gandhi recognized, like in my own work, that we need to move beyond the culture of contest. He had deep concerns about it. You know, he was asked what he thought of Western civilization, which is really embodies the culture of contest. His response was, I think it would be a good thing. In other words, he'd like to see the Western people become civilized. So Gandhi wrote that for us to move beyond these habits, we need what he called a constructive program. And what he meant by a constructive program is actively building, constructing new social institutions, new social norms, new social practices that we want, more just and peaceful ones. And we need to do this right within the shell of the existing society, the sort of oppressive social order that we find ourselves in. In other words, we have to begin to build the alternative world we want to live in. And Gandhi tried to rally the Indian population behind a constructive program of this kind, but it was difficult. He wasn't able to mobilize in a unified way enough people. And so he resorted to tactics like civil disobedience as a compromise. And he actually wrote about this. Because the struggle to construct a new social order is actually in many ways more difficult than protests and civil disobedience. It requires vision, dedication, long-term commitment, creativity. It requires sacrificing significant amounts of time and energy to a higher cause. And it also requires resilience. And the reason for that is once you start building a new social order that's more just, people who benefit from the oppressive system will notice what's going on. Some, of course, will want to join it because some people who benefit from the existing system don't necessarily want to perpetuate it. They'd like to see an alternative, but others actually are wedded to it, are attached to the existing system, will attack the constructive program and try to repress it. So what we need is constructive resilience, right? Which is a theme I've been examining recently. And let me give a concrete example of all this, a constructive program, and so the resilience it takes. I'm sure I know there's people from all over the world on this call, but I'm sure most of you are well aware that African Americans have been oppressed on this continent, in the Americas, especially the United States, for 400 years now, beginning with slavery, then Jim Crow segregation, and other forms of oppression and discrimination like mass incarceration, things that continue to this day. And when we think about the struggle for racial justice in this country, in the US, we often think of the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and other heroes of nonviolent civil disobedience. But what we tend to overlook are the constructive programs many African Americans have engaged in throughout this same period. These include the construction of schools, colleges, and universities. Over 400 colleges and universities across the country serving historically Black populations. They include the construction of economic cooperatives, businesses, and financial institutions, the construction of churches, libraries, legal organizations, and mutual aid societies. African Americans were excluded from virtually all of those institutions within the wider society. So they rolled up their sleeves and began constructing new ones that operated on different rules. Now, we rarely tell this part of the story of the struggle for racial justice in the United States, the constructive program. And we rarely tell the story of other constructive programs to overcome oppression. In fact, Gandhi had one and most people never heard about it. As a result, we limit our imagination regarding how we can struggle to address injustice. Because if we don't see what we've done in the past, it's hard to imagine what's possible in the future. Now, my contrast between the constructive program and, let's say, protests and civil disobedience, it's not meant to imply criticism of those who choose to struggle through protest and civil disobedience. They're doing important work, they've made important accomplishments, and they deserve our admiration and respect, which I'm filled with for activists of this kind. But I think we also need to expand our toolkit for social change. In fact, today protests are getting bigger and more numerous and having less and less effect. It seems they're reaching a point of diminishing returns in certain ways. If we hope to move beyond the culture of contest then, which is one of the underlying causes of oppression in our society, we need to consider the radical potential of constructive programs. And by radical, the word radical comes from the word root. It just means getting to the root of the problem. So when I use the word radical, that's what I'm talking about, getting to the root of the problems we face. We need to build the new society we want to live in right here, right now, all around the world. But since we don't know exactly how to do that yet, we need to learn our way forward. Right? We need to learn by acting collectively with others, reflecting on our actions, consulting, adjusting our plans and approaches, and persevering in the face of difficulties. There's no other route. It's long and difficult, but it's the way out, so to speak, of the culture of contest. So that's what my program of research is currently focusing on. It's also what some of the university classes I teach focus on. For instance, I'm teaching a course now on nonviolent social change. And we examine the history and the philosophy and a lot of examples, including this concept of constructive programs. I also teach a course on ethics, in which students develop the capacity to analyze the moral worth of social structures and arrangements in contemporary society, and think about how to apply principles such as justice and equity and unity to the reform or reconstruction of those arrangements. And I also teach a course on media studies, which examines the role of the media in all of this, and how to work for media reform and the construction of alternative media. So I think I've gone on long enough. I want to have maybe more of a conversation than you just listening to me. So I understand that there's a way to pose questions, and I'm happy to try to respond to them, and we can have more of a dialogue if that's all right.
Yes, I mean, I want to invite all the participants to type in their questions on the Q&A box that you have on the bottom of your screen, if you see here. Professor Karlberg, this is wonderful, really, how much you have addressed in just 20 minutes. That's amazing. You know, you mentioned that the educational system is based on competition, which it is. What are some practical steps that we as parents or students and educators and the school administrators can take to change this?
You know, it's a challenging thing. Of course, it's a large system and these things are deeply entrenched. There certainly are many movements among educators to try to, you know, teach collaborative processes and move away from the competitive model. But of course, at the end of the day, when you have to give grades out, it comes back to so some form of competition. You know, I went to an undergraduate program at UC Santa Cruz that didn't have grades. It was quite refreshing, actually. So there are ways, like even in a university, to move away from grade-based instruction. My daughters went through Montessori programs for 6 and 8 years, respectively. And Montessori has no grades. There's no competition. It's really, and what I witnessed is that they never lost the love of learning. You know, when you go to school and you basically think that learning is about getting a grade, you externalize the motivation to learn. So there are some models out there that have tried to do this, tried to move away from competition. They're not necessarily the perfect or the only or, you know, the ultimate model, but there are models we can draw insights from as we begin to experiment. You know, I teach at a university that requires me to grade my students, so I'm caught within the system, so to speak. Even though I recognize its limitations, I try to do my best to minimize its problems. So those are, I guess, a few thoughts.
And can you expand a little bit, perhaps, on the role of the media in fostering a contest of a culture of contest, which you referred to briefly? I think that
Sure.
something perhaps that the youth should be aware of, you know, to deconstruct the role of the media.
Yeah. So, of course, there are many different kinds of media. And my concerns and critique mostly are about commercial media, and it's specifically media that are financed by advertising revenues. That's a particular model that produces certain outcomes. The easiest way to think about it is this, that advertising financed media, and that ranges, you know, from television, traditional television, to a lot of social media today, and, you know, other online, you know, forums, YouTube and so forth, that are being increasingly driven by advertising. With advertising media, the business model ultimately is this. It's not about producing high quality content and selling it to consumers or audiences. It's about manufacturing audiences and selling them to advertisers. That's actually the business model. And if we don't think clearly about it, we're just like, you know, living in illusion. So if your goal is to manufacture audiences and sell them to advertisers for profit, then you want to figure out how to manufacture the largest audience at the lowest cost. And what's the best way to do that? Well, cheap spectacle. In other words, inexpensive content that's filled with violence, conflict, sex, these sorts of things that grabs our attention. And, you know, it's naturally it grabs our attention. Like, there were probably good historical reasons for people to pay attention to violence. That's how we survived, by trying, you know, notice it and running, or avoiding it, and so forth. Like, but the problem is conflict, violence, and sex are to media what sugar, salt, and fat are to food. They're like cheap ingredients that are kind of addictive. Highly profitable if you're producing junk food or junk food media, but not necessarily healthy for anybody. So we have constructed media systems that basically manufacture audiences, sell our attention to advertisers by trying to attract us with cheap spectacle, kind of junk food media. And it works. It's a very profitable formula. But in the process, it amplifies and exaggerates really the most unhealthy aspects of human nature. And it even convinces us that those are like normal, natural, inevitable ways to behave. It shapes our perception, actually, of our own reality. That's a very powerful influence. So that's, I guess, part of my analysis of, you know, the role the media play in this.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. We have several questions actually coming in. I will try to go through them. This is a question from Monica and Isaiah. The constructive programs that grew out of segregation, like the HBCUs, churches, banks, further segregation in some ways. How did they further the integration, or was integration not the goal?
Well, integration, of course, wasn't possible. So, you know, obviously integration wasn't possible. These were institutions that were constructed to enable African Americans to get education, have economic opportunities, I mean, do all the essential things they needed to develop their latent capacities. And they were very successful. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's still a long way to go in this country in terms of overcoming racism and discrimination. But these institutions played a tremendous role in uplifting major segments of the African American community. Now, when integration, for instance, of schools later occurred through Supreme Court, you know, ruling and so forth, it's quite interesting that today, a lot of people are debating the net sort of costs and harms of that for the African American community, because in a lot of cases, it moved African Americans from schools they had constructed where they were learning from Black teachers who cared about them and surrounded by other Black students who you know, respected one another. And then you had small numbers of Black students moving into all white schools with white teachers who were often racist, and it was quite traumatizing and challenging environment for young African Americans. So, you know, the path of, you know, from, let's say, segregation to integration is a complex path, very complex path. Mistakes have been made. It's, you know, we're not there yet, so to speak, you know, but these institutions that African Americans constructed played a very important role in uplifting them, propelling them, you know, forward on that path. I don't know if that, you know, adequately answers your question, but the goal of these institutions was not, the goal of the African American constructive program was not segregation. It was survival, coping, upliftment in an environment where they were forced into segregation. And it's interesting to note that their schools were not closed to whites. And in fact, there were examples gradually over time of white students actually choosing to go to historically Black colleges and universities and things like that. So they were not choosing segregation or enforcing segregation. They were just creating spaces where they could learn.
Sorry,
You're muted.
I was muted. I'm sorry.
Oh.
This is another question. We as humans are all motivated differently. Does neurochemistry of the brain change depending on the nurture environment? Or can we learn to get fed by no contest?
So I'm not sure I understand the second half of that question. Can you say that again? It was a little choppy.
So we as humans are all are motivated differently. Does neurochemistry of the brain change depending on the nurture environment? Can we learn to get fed as of food by no contest? I mean, can the brain learn to get fed by being in an environment where there is no contest? Is it satisfying to us?
Yeah, so I would say, I guess, a few things. No question that how we're raised, our social environment, our education, all these things shape how our brains, our minds develop. I would say large numbers of people on this planet today are neurologically traumatized by their social environment. And those, have lasting, profound impacts on how we think and feel and function, leading to anxiety and depression and all sorts of challenges. Beyond that, and I think your question is, if I understand it, going deeper than that, if we think about the sort of range, the natural diversity of personalities and character traits that we also all inherit, right? There's inherent diversity in us, in our personalities. Are we all capable of learning and growing and responding to cooperation and mutualism and these sorts of things? And I think the answer to that is yes. There's abundant evidence that humans are profoundly cooperative creatures. We have remarkable capacity for this. I do not believe for a moment that some humans are born competitive and others are born cooperative. We do have different personality traits, how we respond and how we express ourselves, and there are some innate tendencies. But cooperation and competition are not somehow traits that some people have and others, don't. These are things all humans can learn. And, it's kind of like saying, think about other social species like bees or ants. Can bees learn to be cooperative members of a hive? Well, of course, that's literally what they're programmed to learn how to do. Humans, of course, are more complicated than bees, but we all have, we're the most cooperative species on the planet. We are capable of forms of cooperation that are so much more sophisticated and complex than any other species on the planet. Every human being is capable of that. So, yeah, I think all the evidence shows that we can all learn and be raised and benefit from nurturing mutualistic cooperative environments.
So another question is, I try to raise my daughter to be cooperative, but many of my family members think she won't survive in the real world. What would you say to this?
Yeah, it's similar to a question I get a lot, which is if we shelter our children from all the junk food, media, how will they survive when they go out in the world where everybody's talking about it all the time? I I don't buy the argument. Like I don't, I've never seen any evidence to suggest that people who develop their like cooperative potentials are worse off in the world, are somehow less able to survive, cope, or survive. In fact, I think quite the contrary. They tend to lead happier, more enriching, more meaningful, more fulfilling lives. Now, if your goal is to become, you know, a billionaire by exploiting people all across the planet, you're probably not going to reach that goal. But that's not the source of happiness. Like literally, there's tons of evidence showing that extreme wealth is not a source of human happiness. Very wealthy people tend to be among the most unhappy in many situations. So of course, one has to define what one means by living a full, rich, meaningful life, and succeeding in life, so to speak. But in my experience, the more competitive and focused on ourself we are, on like getting ahead, getting advantage at the expense of others, or our group's self-interest, the less happy we'll be. The more frustrated, the more meaningless our lives will be.
Mm-hmm. But do you think
and
that
fortunately, increasingly, there are also like literally more and more economic structures. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, that's another question related to this one. Do you think schools and students are the most likely incubator for constructive programs for social change?
I think young people, if that's what this means, have always been and will always be at the forefront of social change. That doesn't mean every young person, but young people in general are more ready, more willing, more able to work for social change. Of course, I think we need to give young people the tools to do that more and more effectively to the extent we can. So how we educate them plays an important role. I think schools can and should play an important role. I mean, I teach this course on nonviolent social change at the university. I think it'd be great to see that taught in the K-12 school. I mean, why not? And again, I'm not talking about just like teaching civil disobedience. I'm talking about the whole range of possibilities, including this constructive program.
So related to this again is another one. If the concept of competition is taught to us at such a young age and is almost ingrained in us, can we and how do we change this at an older age?
Well, of course, it's harder to change when you're older. I mean, that's the reality. It's harder for all of us to overcome habits we've developed, the older we get. That's just a reality. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. One can still develop new patterns of thought, new habits of mind and behavior at any age. But of course, younger people are more malleable. They have more plasticity. It was what neuroscientists would call it, to be molded and shaped and trained in these ways. So the younger we start, the better, absolutely, in terms of raising these behavioral sort of patterns and things. But there's another part of this too, which is another challenge as you age, of course, is you're often forced to participate in social structures that want to make you behave in competitive ways. So even if you're not inclined to do these things, you often find yourself in situations where that's asked of you. And then you have to make difficult choices. Do you opt out of those kinds of institutions, or do you do your best within the structure but try to minimize those sorts of patterns? So it's not just the way our individual personalities and form and so forth. it's also the institutions we then grow up into. And those continue to shape our behavior, our habits, our patterns.
So there are two questions, I think they are related. Do you think American culture has become more or less competitive over time? Or has it stayed relatively constant over our short history? And then another question, I'll read it now, is the current pandemic is exposing the inequalities that exist in our educational system, especially K through 12 public schools in disadvantaged communities. When we come out of this, do you think this will finally be the call to action we so desperately need? How do we collectively work towards this for the benefit of everyone?
Okay, so the first question, have Americans become more competitive over time? That's a hard thing to assess. Certainly there are currents of competitive, self-interested, conflictual sort of behavior that rise and fall in American society that get more prominence and more attention and so forth. And to some extent, we're in a moment where certainly some of those things are becoming quite prominent. But I don't think they necessarily represent the masses of Americans in terms of what most people want, the world they want to live in. I mean, I find my students actually, over the 20-some years I've been teaching at a university, I think they're becoming increasingly skeptical of the sort of hyper-competitive world they live in. Capitalism as an economic system has less respect from young people in this country now than at any point in the history of this country that they've been trying to measure these things. And no, don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about markets. There's a difference between markets and capitalism. Capitalism is a way of structuring markets that privileges the accumulation of capital over all other values, right? And that system, the majority of young people in this country now think it is a bad system. Like, they're looking for alternatives. They're not clear necessarily on what the alternatives are. So I think young people in general are moving away from this in this country. Obviously not every young person. And I think a lot of ordinary Americans of every age have higher aspirations, even if they don't know how to express them or what the alternatives look like. In terms of this moment we live in and what it's exposing and what comes next, I'm heartened to hear more and more people saying we can't go back to the old normal. We're going to need a different normal after all this. That's a good sign. Like, people are beginning to question the deepest assumptions and values underlying this sort of American experiment. That's a good thing. I've never heard so many people questioning so deeply the kind of American system and its values. But, and of course, I think in my lifetime, never have the racial and other inequities in this country been under the microscope to such an extent as they are right now. And that's also a good thing. I mean, you really have to have your head deep in the sand not to see, not to believe and understand the injustices in this country today. That's all good. But will it change? I think that's an open question that basically has to do with how many people are willing to roll up their sleeves and work for change. Because there's a difference between knowledge, and I do think people are becoming more knowledgeable about how broken the system is and how inequitable it is. There's a difference between knowledge and action. And in between those two is will, right? You need knowledge, you need will, and you need to translate that knowledge and that will into action. I think it remains to be seen whether enough Americans will roll up their sleeves and take action to bring about deep, deep change. It's an open question. But I do also believe this, that if we fail to seize this moment and start working on these deep changes, we're going to face worse crises. And eventually, we're going to learn the hard way that we have to change. So I'm optimistic in the long run that especially young generations of people in this country will start to work for profound change. But whether it's going to happen right after this pandemic, I don't know. We'll see. I hope. I hope we make forward motion. Oops.
I'm sorry, I forget to. Okay, so are there examples of societies that have thrived by practicing cooperative instead of competitive values?
Well, you know, the interesting thing is the most, let's say, the oldest societies, the oldest human societies, hunter-gatherer societies, are highly cooperative. In hunter-gatherer societies, in most hunter-gatherer societies, there is no internal competition between members. It's all about cooperation and mutualism. Like, compared to what we know today, the kind of competition, like self-interested competitive behavior that we think is natural, it arose largely after the agricultural revolution and settled urban populations and, you know, densities and social hierarchies began to emerge. So there's a way in which the kind of competition we think is normal, it was actually a late development in human civilization. Now, it's true that hunter-gatherer societies sometimes a given tribe or community might have competed against other tribes or communities for, you know, resources and territory. But internally, they tended to be highly cooperative. So there has been competition between communities that goes back, certainly. But the challenge, the difference today, of course, is we're one community. Like humanity is one community. Like it or not, we're interdependent. There is no other. There is no other community we can't afford to compete against. So this is the first time in human history it's become obvious. This pandemic has made it obvious, if global warming didn't before that, and so forth. So when we say, are there societies we can look to that demonstrate cooperation? Yeah, basically every ancient society that existed to varying degrees, far more than we see today. And of course, we still see this in many indigenous cultures around the world today that have preserved more of that. But in terms of like modern, you know, societies, we can certainly see societies that express these things to different degrees. So the Scandinavian countries have created much more cooperative, fair, and economically, you know, just and equitable societies than we have in the United States. That's a measure of sort of moving away from competition and towards cooperation, the willingness to share resources, to pay taxes for the benefit of other people who have needs, all these sorts of things. So Scandinavians have taken some steps. Now, Scandinavians have some challenges still that they have to work out. You know, they were very homogeneous populations when they developed these sort of economic models, equitable models. Now that they've opened their door to large numbers of immigrants, including many people of color, they're having to confront the challenges of racism and the strains that that's brought to their society, and they still need to, let's say, prove their capacity to overcome those challenges. But relatively speaking, on an economic level, they've created far more cooperative societies than American society, for instance. So I think we can look to examples like those.
Professor Karlberg, I know that our time is up now, and there are several questions that we were not able to get to. I don't know if you can take one more question or should we? Well,
Sure.
one more question, Professor Karlberg. What do you think, or how do you think, or do you think that building empathy in youth is connected to the idea of cooperation rather than contest?
Absolutely, I think it's connected. I mean, the ability to feel what other people's are feeling, you know, to understand the suffering of others, to feel and relate to and want to relieve the suffering of others is a very important part, I think, of this. So fostering empathy, the capacity for empathy, is very closely connected to this. I would, you know, there are other qualities we could add to that, though. It doesn't just come down to empathy. So, you know, if we think about one of the main things we need to do is quiet our ego, like that insistent self, that part of us that just wants to focus on self and our needs and our appetites and our interests. And that's a part of us that we can learn how to quiet, how to calm down, how to, you know, keep in check, how to regulate, so to speak. But that takes work. And that takes training and effort and discipline. And it's also, I would say, a big part of this, you know, the internal work that needs to be done to create a more cooperative society.
Thank you very much, Professor Karlberg. This was wonderful. I'm sorry that we didn't have time to go through all the questions. I want to stay within the time limit that you gave us. And I want to ask all the participants that if you have suggestions on how we can improve our program, please type it in the chat box. This program has been recorded, will be available on our website. Professor Karlberg kindly agreed to that. And our next session is this Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And Professor Michael Penn will be talking about the sources of hope and hopelessness. And I invite you all to join us. I'll be sending a reminder tomorrow. Professor Karlberg, thank you so much again for participating, for being with us.
Thank you for organizing this. I wish I could have met all the participants face to face or in some other way, but I hope it was a useful conversation, and I wish you all well.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
All right. Bye-bye.
I'll leave the room open a little bit for everyone to be able to type their comments on the chat if you have any suggestions as well. Thank you, Professor Karlberg.